So Malling 9 used to be the province crab of France.
Okay.
Probably used as early as the 12th century. And then they brought them back, kind of make sure they had something that was genetically uniform, started propagating it. So the original group were just finds from around Europe. Then M26 is kind of like the first of the crosses they made. I think it's been around since about maybe 1899 or 1900.
Molly 26?
Malling.
Malling?
Named after the East Malling Research Station along Ashton, England.
Okay.
Okay, so this is my rootstock, Malling 26. I've made a not too fabulous cut, first a long sloping cut, but generally 3/4 of an inch to an inch long is what we like.
Yeah.
Then I made the tongue cut, which is always above the pith, towards the point. Now I'm going to match it to a piece of cyanwood, and that's about right. SCION, and if you read some of the old genealogy things, you'll see things like CION. Sometimes you might say. And then I'm going to make the same cuts on the bottom of the scion. I hope, yeah. Same deal. Again, above the pith, towards the point. I work it in slowly because wood tends to split. Once it gets going, the knife really travels. Notice how I hold it? I put my thumb on the side, so if it does hit, the blade hits the end of my thumb, and the thumbnail stops it, so they don't...
Oh.
Because that's not a moving part, so it heals quickly.
You're a brave man.
Then I simply cut this off so it's a couple buds long. 1, 2. They go together like a jigsaw puzzle. Put them together with some force. We want good contact. The key is cambial contact. So the reproductive layer that separates the bark or the phloem from the hardwood underneath, the xylem, the cambial layer or zone of each has to touch. That reproductive zone has to touch. It'll take, 11 to 20 days, depending on temperature and whatever, for that to heal. The cyanwood was collected back in March. It's been in cold storage in the refrigerator. It's been in a poly bag with a little bit of moist paper towel so it wouldn't dry out. These are just suckers that were growing up in the tree, 100% vegetative wood. We've collected this, brought it out. Now, before these buds can break, they've got to go through a heat treatment. So they've got to accumulate so many hours of heat before they can start to grow. During that period of time, the graft union will heal. And I think that's an important point. This is dormant, not dead. So some living things are happening, so the healing process will indeed occur. I'm just going to get rid of that little ugly tab.
And the rootstock is dormant as well?
The rootstock is, semi-dormant. It's going to grow pretty quickly. It'll respond more quickly than the scion. So the use of dwarf rootstocks is really the key. And it's really interesting. Last year, we had a very unusual warming event in March. We had 8 days, an 8-day period, during which 7 days popped 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And it was a mirror to within 0.2 of a degree Fahrenheit of what happened in the mid-1940s. The difference is in the mid-1940s we had no apples at all. Last year we still had a pretty decent crop. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons we had a pretty decent crop is because we used a lot of dwarfing rootstocks. And the apples grafted on dwarfing rootstocks had almost full crops. The ones on standard rootstocks had a dramatically reduced crop. Okay,
it's so just the nature of a dwarf rootstock?
Well, part of it is the fact that you tend to plant the trees close and you create almost a tent-like environment, which helps to protect it moisture, temperature-wise. The other issue, though, is that dwarfing rootstocks tend to stimulate flower production on one-year-old wood. And the flower buds that form on one-year-old wood are 3 to 5 days later in development than the flower buds that develop on spurs. So as a result, you end up with a tree that's better able to handle late frost.
And what did you wrap that with? That's plastic?
That's just a plastic bread bag. This came off, let me see. This came off High Crown white bread.
And why do you use a bread bag?
Well, it's food grade polyethylene, and B, it does not have any UV stabilizers in it, so it's going to break down rather quickly out in the environment under sunlight, which I want. Because it's food grade, it doesn't have any chemicals that can damage my living tissue, which is very important.
Okay.
and because it's cheap. So it works very well.
It's free with a loaf of bread?
Correct. Yeah,
like
and
it.
it works
I like
very,
it.
very well. And I am, after all, cheap. So that was a Macintosh. This is your
Those are all
old-fashioned Mac, old striper Mac, which some would contend has better flavor than some of the newer Macs that are on the
My
market.
customers say so, which is why I'm wanting some.
Okay.
But I want them on a dwarf rootstock.
I don't blame you, because you want to live to get the fruit. And, if I was planting apple trees for wildlife out in the woods, particularly if I'm trying to draw deer in, which seems to be a very popular deal right now,
Yeah.
then I would want to have, probably a standard size rootstock as my deal. I would put some sort of a wire cage around the tree till it was 5 or 6 years old, and then the tree should be up above the brow zone of the deer, and the tree will survive long term. Unfortunately, on standard rootstock, we're talking 7, 8, 9, 10, sometimes longer years before they come into production. From my perspective as a person who wants to eat apples, I want them into production quickly. And with dwarfing rootstocks, we can have fruit as early as 2 years after planting, but typically within 3 years we will.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that quick.
Now these won't be quite that quick because we in a sense, we have to take a year. We have to grow next year what you would normally buy from the nursery.
Right.
But certainly within 4 years, I'd anticipate some fruit.
Oh, that's great.
So I cut my bread bag into strips that are roughly 1 inch wide, if I can find one in here. I know there's a bunch here. Yeah, where did they go? There's one. That does very well grabbing these. And I simply start below the graft union. I hold it with my finger, and notice I stretch it lightly with my thumb as I go. So it's making a nice, tight seal that will prevent that cambial zone from drying out. Very, very important that cambial zone not dry out. If it dries out, the graft union will fail because the healing that has to occur has to come from that reproductive layer of tissue called the cambium. I just do a simple half hitch, tie it off.
So if it dies,
Yep.
we'll still have a rootstock.
Correct. Even if it
And we can
dies,
start over?
we can graft it again next year if it dies. Correct. But I would normally expect, the success rate with this type of grafting to be pretty close to 100%.
It's pretty close to perfect.
You want to try to make that first cut. You really want it to be flat. So when you hold the knife blade up against it, there aren't any gaps.
Let me get that in the...
Obviously,
where am I? Right there.
If you have any gaps, obviously that's air spaces where you're not having cambial contacts. You want a single smooth cut.
Okay.
So what I've always done for years is I've held the knife very securely in my hand, and I use my thumb like an idler arm.
Yep.
And as I pull the wood through, I put pressure on. Otherwise, the wood will yield under the pressure of the knife, and you'll end up with a scalloped slope. So now we're going to G30 for these. So when you make your little tag, you want to put Mac G30. Got it? Mm-hmm. I think I said G30.
Okay, what's G30 stand for?
G30 stands for Geneva 30. So that was a breeding program developed for rootstocks developed by a guy named Jim Cummins, the father of the guy out at Cummins Nursery.
Yes.
And he developed a series of rootstocks called the Cornell Geneva series. Initially they were called CG, but now they just call them G for Geneva. The Cornell Geneva series includes quite a few rootstocks, including this one, G30. G30 is a tree that's probably maybe a tad bigger than that M26, maybe.
Which means it's going to be how big?
Maybe 10 to 11 feet max. So again, I'll start with my cuts. First, my long sloping cut. Oh, not very long. Yeah. Get the camera on, so whittling. Again, I make my tongue cut. Notice my thumb on the side, so if the blade runs, it hits the end of my thumb, not my knuckle. I've done that once in my life. That's enough. And this, I don't really have anything quite big enough, so I'll just line it up on one side. No big deal. My long sloping cut, make my tongue cut. Cut them off to 2 buds. Well, actually just one. That's all right. Doesn't matter. One's all it takes. put them together, making sure they line up on one side because the scion is slightly smaller than the rootstock. So at least make sure they line up on one side so you get tremendous contact all along that whip and tongue that I've made.
Yeah.
I often call it a whip graft because, you might use these as a whip for driving oxen,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And of course the whip and tongue because you make a tongue cut.
They would make a great whip.
The other thing
Oh,
that's
yeah.
kind of interesting is that they are often called bench grafting because it's normally done inside on a bench. Right?
That's simple.
Yeah, we keep things
Well,
very
we
simple.
don't do bench grafting here.
We're doing tailgate grafting.
Yes, that's
So this
right.
is a tailgate graft. So I'm just going to wrap this nicely so it's nice and protected. I don't want that cambial tissue to dry out. We need that reproductive tissue alive and well. And now I just do my half hitch. And we have cloned. Mad cloners.
Okay.
Oh,
So
wait, this is
show me,
good.
explain to me where you're cutting the rootstock now and why.
Well, I'm normally trying to cut 4 or 5 inches above the root, above the top root.
Yeah.
Eventually, as I plant these trees out, I'm going to want this graft union to be about 2 inches above ground.
Yeah.
So I'll plant it to here in my garden this year. This will root up in here. When
Yeah.
I move it out into the final spot, I'll probably move that soil line up to there. The entire shank will be rooted. My graft union will be above ground.
Okay.
Macintosh was originally an apple seedling.
Yeah.
And if it is allowed to root, which it would do attached to a rootstock, you'd end up with a full-size tree. So we have to make sure we keep the graft union above ground so that the tree remains dwarf.
Okay.
I'm just going to sharpen.
So you're not really counting the number of buds.
Nah, I don't pay any attention to it. Some people do. I can't be bothered.
So I'm going to plant these
In the vegetable garden,
in
correct.
the veggie garden this year.
Correct.
All right.
And they're going to grow, hopefully, reasonably well. Normally, I'd suggest you maybe plant them about a foot apart. Leave them in the vegetable garden all next summer if you can bring yourself to do that. And then either dig them in October of 2014 and move them then, or dig them very early in the spring of 2015 and move them then. In the ideal world, 2 full summers in the vegetable garden. Now, if some of these trees grow really well this year, dig those out and move them next spring into your final resting spot. And what do I mean by really well? At least 35, 36 inches of growth. So if they pop right
Oh,
up
wow.
pretty well, great. If not, leave them in the vegetable garden for 2 years before you move them.
Do I fertilize them or anything?
Yeah, you can start fertilizing them, but wait till they grow a bit.
Yeah.
Let them get started.
Yeah.
Maybe just get something like some Miracle Grow and give them a weekly shot of that from about, I'll say June 1 through about the 10th of July, and then call it quits.
Okay.
And then next year, we can challenge them a little more. So in a sense, what you're doing, I mean, in a commercial nursery, these would be grafted now, and they would do exactly what I've suggested. They would sort them in the spring. The ones that had really grown well, they would dig out and sell as what they call half grafts. But most of them would be in the nursery for 2 summers, so that they have branches, and then it'd be sold as quote-unquote feathered trees. So the branches are often called feathers in the nursery trade. They're not technically feathers, and I'll explain that difference in a sec. But let me see. Pull this down. So what's going to happen, obviously, is these buds are going to start to grow. In the ideal world, if they're both growing well, I'd thin them down to a single bud, a single shoot, and get rid of all the shoots down here eventually.
Like the middle of the summer?
Yeah, maybe by middle of June. They're growing well. Pick just the best one. I like to put a road grade stake or something near it and tie it loosely to it so it doesn't get broken off. Birds will sometimes land on them or break them off, which is a pain in the neck. And it'll grow pretty vigorously, hopefully, in a nice upright fashion.
Stake it.
Stake it. Let it rip. Keep them watered. and fertilize them lightly with something like Miracle Grow, and you'll end up with a pretty nice tree. It's called a rooted layer, or a rootstock. And you'll notice that it was excised or cut off of something last year. Well, how was this grown? Because rootstocks, like varieties, don't come true to seed. So we have to propagate them in a non-sexual or asexual manner. So in this particular case, if I was going to try to propagate this at home, I would simply plant it in my garden about here, and then I would cut it off 2 or 3 inches above ground level. In response to that pruning, buds would break and form vigorous upright shoots.
Above ground?
Above ground. And below ground, doesn't really matter, but several shoots would shoot up in response to that hard pruning.
Okay.
During the course of the summer, I would gradually cover the bottom third of those with moist sawdust. While they're still attached to this root system,
Yeah.
and yet mounded in moist sawdust, they will root. Come spring, very early spring, I pull the sawdust away, I cut them off, they'll have roots, and I have this, a rooted layer. And the parent plant will do it again, and again, and again forever. This process is called stooling, S-T-O-O-L-I-N-G, so it's a stool bed, it's called. It's just a form of layering. And it works.